There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a community when it realizes it was wrong. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest. The silence of a room full of people who laughed at a woman, who passed her fields with slow headshakes and muttered, "Bless her heart," like it was a curse dressed in sympathy, now standing at her fence with their hats in their hands and drought cracking the soles of their boots. I've seen men walk into battle without flinching. I've seen Apache warriors hold their ground against cavalry charges that should have broken them in under a minute. I've watched horses refuse to surrender even when their legs were failing underneath them. But I have never, not once in all my years of writing and recording, and watching this land swallow people whole, seen anything hit harder than the moment a quiet woman is proven right by catastrophe. Her name was Della Voss. She wasn't loud about what she knew. She wasn't preachy. She didn't write letters to the county office or stand up at the church social and declare herself wiser than the men who'd been farming this territory since before she was born. She just planted what she planted, rotated what she rotated, and kept going. And when the dry season came like a death sentence for everything green within 40 miles, her fields held. This is what I saw, this is what I wrote down. And this is the part no one in Lander County likes to talk about, because it doesn't end the way pride wants it to. It ends the way truth always does. Quietly and a little too late for some. I've kept one since I was 19 years old and working cattle drives across the panhandle under a foreman named Cutter Hayes, who told me, and I believe him still, that a man who doesn't write things down is just a man waiting to forget who he was. So I carry a leather-bound journal in my saddlebag, the current one held shut with a strip of rawhide I haven't replaced in 2 years, and I write in it every evening whether there's something worth saying or not. The entry for the 14th of April, 1887 reads, "Past the Voss land again." She's planted legumes in the north field where Hartley swears winter wheat should go. Odd woman, strange fields, sky looks like copper. That's all I wrote. I didn't think it was worth more than that. My name is Ellis Rohn, and I contract out as a land surveyor and occasional livestock assessor for 3 counties in central Wyoming territory. It means I spend most of my life on horseback, moving between properties, noting things down, occasionally settling border disputes that should have been settled 30 years ago and weren't because the men involved would rather be angry than right. I am not a farmer. I don't pretend to understand everything a farmer understands. But I've been riding these routes for 11 years, and I know what a field looks like when it's being managed with intention versus one that's just being worked out of habit. Della Voss's fields had intention in them. The problem, and this was apparent from the first time I stopped my horse along the county road and actually looked, was that her intention didn't match anybody else's in Lander County. While every other homestead from the Hartley spread to the Combs operation on the eastern ridge was running the same winter wheat cycle that had worked, more or less, for 15 years, Della was running something different. She had divided her property into 6 sections, not 4 the way most farms were parceled, 6. And she rotated through them in a sequence that I couldn't initially make sense of. Nitrogen-fixing crops here, fallow ground there, a cover crop of clover pressed into a strip between her 2 main cultivated sections, like she was building a border against something invisible. The first time I saw it up close was when I stopped to refill my canteen at her well in early spring of that year, the year I'm writing about now. She came out of the barn with her sleeves already rolled past her elbows and mud on her forearms up to the elbow crease. And she looked at me the way a woman looks at someone who has stopped moving for no apparent reason in front of her property. "You lost," she said. "No, ma'am, just watering my horse." She nodded once, not friendly, not unfriendly. Just acknowledging. I nodded at the north field, where those legume rows were running long and green even in the April chill. "That's an unusual rotation you've got." She looked at the field, then back at me. "Unusual how?" "Most folks around here are running straight winter wheat. Hartley, Combs, the Braden brothers. You're the only one with legumes in the north section this cycle." She wiped her forearm across her forehead and left a faint streak of dark soil above her brow. She didn't look bothered by the observation. She looked, if anything, slightly tired of the subject, like she'd had this conversation before and already knew how it ended. "Wheat pulls nitrogen from the soil," she said. "If you don't put it back, eventually the soil gets tired." Hartley would say you're wasting space that could be producing. Something passed across her face, not quite amusement, not quite irritation, something in between. Hartley's been saying a lot of things, she said. I'm not farming Hartley's land. She turned and went back into the barn, and that was the end of our first real conversation. I should tell you about Lander County in that spring of 1887, because without understanding the place, you can't understand why what happened to Della mattered as much as it did. The county was not a cruel community. That's important to say clearly, because the cruelty that accumulates around a person who does things differently rarely comes from malice alone. Lander County was a community under pressure, land payments coming due, cattle prices dropping, a 3-year stretch of reasonable rainfall that had lulled everyone into a pattern of confidence that was maybe a half-inch of precipitation away from becoming catastrophe. When people are that close to the edge, they don't respond well to someone among them doing something different. Different things require a different explanation. A different explanation implies the old one was wrong. And when the old explanation is what you've staked your livelihood on, being wrong is not a philosophical problem. It's a financial one. Howard Hartley ran the largest operation in the county, 400 acres, 2 sons working full-time, a wife who sold baked goods on Saturday mornings at the county exchange. He was not a bad man. He was respected. He was the kind of man who people quoted at town meetings because they'd heard him say something sensible once and never forgotten it. He had been saying things about Della Voss for 2 growing seasons by the time I started paying serious attention. She's wasting good ground on cover crops and green manure crops, he told the group of men gathered outside the county exchange one Saturday afternoon in April. I was sitting on the bench outside with my logbook open on my knee, ostensibly updating a land description but actually listening, which is something I do often and without particular shame. Her yield last year was maybe 60% of what she'd get running straight wheat across all 6 sections. That's her choice, said Tom Combs, who was a quieter man than Hartley but not always a wiser one. Her choice affects the county average, Hartley said. He had a particular way of framing things as community problems that was very effective. When the assessor comes through, he looks at average yield. Her low yield pulls the number down, makes us look like we're underperforming. I wrote in my logbook, Hartley using county averages as weapon. Note, Voss yield lower short-term. Long-term unknown. What I didn't write, because I hadn't quite thought it through yet, was that Hartley's argument only made sense if you assumed the existing system was going to keep working, which is the assumption everyone in Lander County was making, and the one assumption Della Voss was not. I rode out to her property 3 times over the course of that spring for legitimate surveying purposes, and once, I'll admit this plainly, just because I wanted to see what was growing. The second time I stopped, she was in the south section doing something with a hand tool I didn't initially recognize. I tied my horse and walked over, and when I got close enough to see what she was doing, I realized she was working compost into the soil ahead of planting, actual compost, the turned and decomposed kind, not just manure spread on top. You're amending before you plant, I said. I always amend before I plant, she said without looking up. Who taught you this system? She paused working, just for a moment. The pause had something careful in it, like she was deciding how much to give away. My grandmother, she said, she was Mennonite, came from Pennsylvania. She kept detailed planting records going back 40 years. She started working again. I have her journals. They're very boring to read and very useful to follow. And you adapted her system to this land. It took 4 years to get the rotation right for this soil type. She glanced up briefly. Every soil is different. You can't just copy someone else's method. You have to read what the land is telling you. And what's this land telling you? She looked at me steadily. That it's tired, she said. It's been pushed hard and given nothing back. The question is whether anyone around here is going to listen before it stops answering at all. I wrote that down that evening almost word for word. I'm looking at it now, and it reads like a prophecy that only sounds obvious in hindsight. The mocking, and I should be honest, it was mocking, not criticism, though some of the men involved would not accept that distinction, started in earnest that May. It had something to do with the church social, which I attended because I was in town, and because Della Voss was reportedly going to be there, and I wanted to observe how the community treated her in a social setting. She came late. She sat near the back. She was wearing a clean dress, the kind that had clearly been pressed that morning, but had the look of a dress that spent most of its life folded away. She had her hair up, but not elaborately, and she brought a dish of something grain-based that I later understood to be made from an ancient variety of wheat she was trialing in her smallest field. A detail that was, of course, entirely lost on everyone present. Howard Hartley's wife, Agnes, was the one who opened it. She did it with a smile that I can only describe as weaponized gentleness. "Della," she said, sitting down across from her, "I heard you're running legumes in 4 of your 6 sections this year." "3, Della said. 3, that's brave. Isn't that brave?" The last sentence was directed at the woman sitting beside Agnes, who made a sound of agreement that could have been genuine or could have been social reflex. "I don't know that it requires bravery," Della said. "It requires planning." Of course. Agnes turned her smile up a fraction. "It's just the boys have been talking, and they're a little worried about you is all, carrying all those fallow sections through summer when you could be yielding. It's a hard way to do it." Della looked at Agnes for a moment. Her expression was measured, contained. She had the face of someone who had a great deal to say and had made a long time ago the decision that saying most of it wasn't worth what it cost. "I appreciate the concern," she said, and ate a small bite of the grain dish she'd brought. That was the whole interaction, but in the way of small communities it was not over after that. It replicated. Hartley had said something at the feed store. His sons had repeated it with embellishments at the stockyard. By June, there was a running half-joke in the county that if you needed to find the most creative way to underuse your land, you should ask Della Voss. She heard it, she had to have heard it. But what I observed, and I was riding that route regularly now, not only for surveying, was that she kept working. Not defiantly, not performatively, just methodically, in the morning, in the evening, with a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, which she pulled out periodically to make marks I couldn't read from the road. I recognized the gesture. It was the same thing I did with my logbook. Once, riding past at dusk, I saw her standing at the edge of the north field with the notebook out, and her face turned toward the sky, reading the color of the clouds the way I'd seen Apache scouts read the same sky. Not for poetry, not for sentiment, but for information. For something real and coming. I wrote that night, "She's watching whether like someone who knows it can kill her. The others are watching prices. They're looking at different things." The summer passed dry, not catastrophically, not yet, but noticeably. Rainfall in July came in at roughly 70% of the prior 10-year average for that month. The Hartley fields drank it up and needed more. His north section, running heavy wheat, was pulling hard from soil that had been running the same cycle for going on 8 years, without any nitrogen restoration. I know this because I surveyed it in August. Hartley wanted the boundary lines confirmed ahead of a lease discussion with a neighboring parcel. While I was there, I walked through his fields the way surveyors do, slowly, noting things, making marks. And what I noted, and put in my logbook but not in my official report because it wasn't my place, was that the soil had a particular look to it. Compacted, pale in places where it should have been dark. The wheat was growing, but the way someone grows who hasn't eaten properly, technically alive, technically functional, but hollow in some hard-to-name way. I rode from Hartley's land to Della's land the same afternoon. The difference was not subtle. Her soil, where she'd been amending and rotating and building organic matter for 4 years, was dark. Deep dark, the color of good river-bottom earth, which it had no geological reason to be. The legume field she'd planted in spring had been turned under and was decomposing, working its nitrogen back into the ground as she'd planned. Her wheat sections, the ones actually running grain this season, were short but dense, with root structures I could see at the field edges where she'd been doing some hand cultivation. Roots going down in a way that suggested the soil beneath had room and moisture and something to hold. She was standing in the middle of the wheat section when I stopped, and she turned at the sound of my horse. "Your neighbor's soil is struggling," I said. I hadn't planned to say it. It came out because it was true and I was still processing the contrast. She looked at me for a moment. "I know," she said quietly. "He doesn't." "I know that too," she said. "Have you considered telling him?" The look she gave me then was not unkind, but it was very direct and it had years of something behind it. "Yes," she said, "I've considered it." And she looked back at her wheat. "A man who spent 2 summers laughing at your methods doesn't tend to receive information from you in good faith," she said. "He hears it as gloating. He turns it into evidence that you think you're better than him, and then you've lost any chance he might actually listen when it matters more." She bent and pulled a handful of soil from the edge of the cultivated row, rubbed it between her fingers, let it fall. "So I wait," she said. "I work and I wait." I watched her walk back toward the barn, and I wrote in my logbook that evening what might be the most important thing I recorded that year. She's not waiting for vindication. She's waiting for the moment they're ready to learn. Different thing entirely. The end of August brought a letter from the county agricultural assessor's office. I saw it referenced at the county exchange. Hartley showed it around because it contained information he considered important. Preliminary yield projections for the county, based on current field conditions and rainfall data, were lower than the prior 2 years. He read the relevant section aloud to 3 men standing near the mail counter, and his voice was the voice of a man presenting evidence he found fully satisfying. Combined yield projection down 12% from last season. Well, he folded the letter. At least we know who's dragging the number down. Nobody said Della's name. Nobody had to. I stood near the window with my coffee going cold in my hand and thought about her soil, dark and deep, and full of something patient. I thought about the copper sky she'd been reading since April. I thought about what a 12% decline in projected yield meant if the dry season got worse. And the dry season, I had observed in my 11 years of riding this territory, had a way of getting worse once it had started. I wrote that night, "Hartley thinks the problem is Della's yield. I think the problem is the soil under his wheat, and I think it's going to show him that it's the problem before spring." I was wrong about the timing. It showed him before winter. September arrived in Lander County, the way trouble arrives when it's been building for a long time, not with a single dramatic event, but with a series of small, undeniable confirmations that something had fundamentally changed. The rain that should have come in the second week of September didn't. Then the rain that should have come at the end of September didn't either. October started with a week of wind that was warm for the season and wrong in a way that the older ranchers, the ones who'd been here long enough to recognize patterns rather than just weather, didn't talk about directly but referenced sideways. You'd hear things like, "Not a good sign," "that wind," and "my grandfather had a name for this kind of October." And then the conversation would move to something else, because naming a bad thing directly felt like inviting it in. I was in Lander County through most of it, because I had a survey assignment that kept getting extended. The northern boundary dispute between the Braden brothers and a new parcel buyer had developed complications, and I found myself riding the same roads I'd been riding all year, watching the same fields, with my logbook accumulating entries that were beginning to tell a story I didn't want to be the one to say out loud. The Combs operation showed stress first. Tom Combs had been running heavy wheat in his best 3 fields for 6 consecutive seasons, 2 more than Hartley, and his soil had less left to give. By mid-October, the fields that should have been showing early green from his winter wheat seeding were coming up thin, patchy, the kind of emergence pattern that meant the seed was germinating but the soil wasn't giving it what it needed to establish. I saw Tom Combs at the county exchange on a Thursday morning, and for the first time in the 2 years I'd been watching this community, he looked genuinely shaken. He was a man in his late 40s with a face that had been organized by weather and hard work into something nearly immovable. But that Thursday morning his face had cracked in a small way that he was working to conceal and not entirely succeeding. He saw me looking and gave me a nod that said, "I know you see it, and don't say anything in equal measure." I nodded back. I rode out to Della's property that afternoon, not for any surveying reason, just because I needed to see how her fields were sitting. She was in the west section, which she'd left as a managed fallow that summer, and was now seeding carefully into winter wheat, working in a methodical line across the field with a hand seeder she'd modified. I could see from the road that she'd attached a small marker line to maintain row consistency, even in wind. She didn't look up when I stopped my horse. "Combs is struggling," I said. "I heard," she said. "His emergence is thin." "It would be," She reached the end of a row and turned, resetting the marker. He's been running the same rotation since he bought that land. The soil's nitrogen depleted. Without sufficient organic matter, water retention drops significantly. In a dry fall, that means seeds germinate but seedlings can't establish. She said it without satisfaction. Just plainly, like reading from the grandmother's journal. He doesn't know that. He hasn't wanted to know that, she said. It was a small but precise distinction. I looked at her west section. The seeding she was doing now was careful, almost gentle, and I understood, watching it, that she wasn't just planting grain. She was planting grain into a field she'd spent a season rebuilding, and the care she was taking was the care of someone who understood that what she was doing was fragile and hard-won and worth doing precisely because it was neither quick nor obvious. "Are you worried?" I asked. It came out more directly than I intended. She stopped moving for a moment, looked up at the sky, the same copper-tinged late afternoon sky I'd been watching all season, the one that didn't seem to know whether it was going to give water or withhold it indefinitely. "I'm always worried," she said. "I've been farming this land for 7 years. I've been worried every season. That's how you stay careful." She looked back down at the row she was seeding. "What I'm not is scared. Those are different things." She went back to work. I rode home and wrote, "She's not farming for this season. She's farming for the next one, and the one after that. Everyone else is farming for right now." The men's meeting, and I call it that because that's what it was, though it was framed as a general community gathering, was called by Howard Hartley in the second week of October, at the community hall attached to the church. I was invited, technically, as a licensed assessor whose opinion on land conditions might carry some professional weight. I understood that my actual function was to be an authority who validated the conclusions Hartley had already reached, which is a role I've been put in before and have varying levels of success, resisting depending on the circumstances. Della was not invited. I noticed this specifically because it was specific. Other landowners, including 2 women who ran operations of comparable or smaller size, received invitations. Della's exclusion had the precision of a deliberate choice. I mentioned this to Hartley before the meeting started, as we stood outside the hall. "She wouldn't be comfortable," he said. The statement had the texture of something that had been pre-constructed. "Has she said so?" He looked at me with an expression that acknowledged I'd found the gap in his logic but expected me not to push on it. "The concerns being discussed are ones where her choices are part of the problem," he said carefully. "It would be awkward." "Her yield projections are higher than yours this fall," I said. Hartley's expression changed. Not dramatically. The man was not given to drama, but something moved across his face that I recognized as a recalibration. He hadn't known, or he'd known in the abstract way of a fact someone told him once and he'd filed in the wrong drawer. "The drought hasn't hit yet," he said, recovering. "Projection isn't production." He went inside. I followed. The meeting had 23 people in it. I noted them down in my logbook, names, positions, expressions. A professional habit that has occasionally made me an uncomfortable person to be around. Hartley opened by presenting the rainfall data, genuine, verifiable data, sourced from the county weather station, and framing it around the question of how to manage collective land output through a potentially difficult winter. He was not wrong about the rainfall numbers. The territory was tracking significantly below the historical average for the preceding 6 months, and the window for winter wheat establishment was narrowing. These were real problems requiring real responses. What he was wrong about, and I watched it unfold over the course of 40 minutes with the particular helplessness of someone who can see a structural error in an argument, but isn't the one whose turn it is to speak, was the diagnosis of why the situation was as precarious as it was. The argument he made, which the room received without significant pushback, was that the current difficulty was a rainfall problem, a weather problem, an external imposition. Something being done to Lander County by a sky that was failing in its obligations. This framing was comforting because it was externalizing. If the drought was the whole problem, then the soil management decisions made over the previous decade were not part of the problem. The rotation systems, or absence of them, were not part of the problem. The continuous wheat cropping that had been pulling nitrogen from soil already stretched thin was not part of the problem. I raised my hand. Hartley acknowledged me with the careful look of a man who's invited an authority figure to validate him, and is now slightly unsure if that was wise. "I want to offer a different framing," I said, and felt the room's attention shift in the way rooms shift when someone is about to say something people don't want to hear. Rainfall is the catalyst, but the extent of the impact is being shaped significantly by soil condition. Some fields in this county are going to weather this better than others, not because they're getting more rain, but because they've been managed in a way that improves water retention and available nutrients. "That's a fair point," Hartley said carefully. "But in practical terms, what we can address tonight is crop management going forward." "That's exactly what I'm suggesting. Going forward, crop management that includes soil health practices, rotation, cover crops, organic amendment, will matter more in a dry season, not less." I paused. "There's someone in this county who's been doing that for 7 years. Her fields are in better condition than most of what I've surveyed this fall." The room knew who I meant. You could tell because nobody asked. Hartley was quiet for a moment. Then, "Voss has been running reduced wheat yield for 4 years in the name of soil maintenance. In a drought year, reduced yield is a liability, not an asset." "Her yield this season isn't reduced," I said. "I've been surveying her land all year. Her winter wheat seeding is into sections that have been building for 2 seasons. Her moisture retention, based on what I've observed in her soil composition, is meaningfully higher than comparable fields in this county." Another silence, longer. Tom Combs, who had been sitting near the back wall with that cracked look still on his face from the week before, spoke without raising his hand. "How much higher?" "I don't have a precise measurement," I said, "but from field observation the difference is significant. The color and composition of her topsoil compared to fields running continuous wheat cycles is not close." Combs looked at the floor. Hartley moved on. He redirected the conversation to government assistance requests, water rights applications, shared resource pooling across the county. All legitimate, all addressing real problems. But when I left that meeting, I had the strong sense that 2 separate things had happened in that room simultaneously. The official discussion, which had been about drought response, and the real discussion, which had been about whether Lander County was going to accept the information that was standing right at its fence line, on 6 carefully managed sections, waiting. The latter half of October confirmed what I'd observed in the field. Hartley's north section, which had been running winter wheat for 8 consecutive years, failed to establish properly in 3 of its 4 planted subsections. The seed germinated. You could see the thin green haze of emergence from the road, but within 2 weeks of emergence, the seedlings were flagging. The soil beneath didn't have enough moisture retention to carry them through the dry nights. 2 of the Braden brothers' fields showed similar failure. The Combs operation, which I'd watched most closely because Tom had been the one in the room who looked like he was actually hearing me, lost nearly 40% of his intended fall yield. 40%. In a county already projecting lower numbers, that was the kind of loss that required a ledger adjustment that hurt. I rode past Della's property on a Tuesday in late October. Her winter wheat was standing. Not dramatically, not triumphantly. The rows were modest in height, appropriate for the establishment stage, but they were even and continuous and green in a way that was increasingly scarce in Lander County. Her south section, the one she'd left fallow the previous spring and amended heavily through summer, was showing the best emergence I'd seen anywhere in the territory that fall. She was at the well when I stopped. She looked up at me, and her expression was the same contained, measuring look it always was, but there was something underneath it that I wasn't sure how to name. "You've been watching all the other fields," she said. It wasn't a question. "It's my job. How are they doing?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Not well," I said. She nodded. She pulled up the well bucket and set it on the stone lip without spilling a drop, the practiced motion of 100,000 repetitions. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want you to understand that it's not what it might sound like." "All right." She looked at me directly. "I don't feel good about this," she said. "I want that on record. I don't feel vindicated. I feel worried, because these are my neighbors and their bad season means a bad county, which means harder winters for everyone, including me." She picked up the bucket. I'm not standing at my fence waiting for people to come apologize. I'm standing at my fence hoping someone comes to ask me how to fix their soil before next spring. She walked back toward the barn. I wrote that night in the logbook, in ink that pressed heavier than usual, because my hand was doing something my brain was trying to tell it. She was never competing with them. They were competing with her. There's a difference that changes everything about what this story means. By November, the word had gotten out in the way that words get out in small communities, sideways, reluctantly, through observations rather than admissions. Hartley's field failure was visible from the county road. Tom Combs had told 3 people about his emergence rate, meaning 30 people knew within a week. The Braden brothers had been seen twice, standing at the fence line between their failing sections and looking east, which was the direction from their property of the Voss land. Nobody came to the fence, not yet. But I'd been watching people for 11 years, and I knew what the gathering themselves upstage looked like. It looked like standing at a fence, staring east, not quite ready to walk toward what you know is there. The thing that broke it open was the Jansen boy. Peter Jansen was 16, the son of a small-plot farmer on the south side of the county who'd had the least investment in the collective mocking, because he'd always been too small to have much standing in the community's opinion either way. The Jansen family didn't have the acreage to run big wheat cycles anyway, so they'd been watching the rotation debates with a certain removed quality, like a family watching a war being fought 2 hills over. Peter had apparently been watching Della's fields specifically, for reasons he'd told his father and his father had mentioned at the feed store, which was where I happened to be standing when it surfaced. Boy's been asking the Voss woman questions, Jansen SR, said to no one in particular, the way men at feed stores share information, not announcing, just releasing it into the air for whoever wants it. She's been answering him. A brief, charged silence. How long's that been going on? Someone said. August, I think, started because he had a biology question from his school correspondence course. She answered it. Apparently it led to other questions. I turned toward the window so no one could see that I was writing in my logbook. I wrote, the information found its way through the one person in the county who didn't have a position to protect. She give him anything useful, someone else said. Another silence, this one longer. His family's small plot is the only other field in this county showing proper establishment this fall, Jansen SR said. Make of that what you will. I made of that exactly what it was. The following Sunday, not at the church social, but after it, in the loose gathering that happens in the side yard when people are not quite ready to go home, I watched Howard Hartley approach Tom Combs and have a conversation I couldn't hear but could read clearly from 60 feet away. Combs was talking. Hartley was listening with his arms crossed, which is what Hartley did when he was receiving information he was in the process of deciding whether to accept. Then Hartley uncrossed his arms. That was what I noted, just that, the arms coming uncrossed. Because in all my years of watching people receive difficult information, I had learned that the arms uncrossing is the moment, not the words that come after, not the eventual decision or the action or the conversation that changes things. The arms uncrossing is the moment a person stops defending the position they walked in with and becomes, briefly, someone who might be taught something. Hartley looked across the side yard, and for a moment his eyes moved toward the county road, the road that led, among other places, to the Voss land. He didn't do anything about it, not that Sunday. But his arms had uncrossed. And in my logbook that evening, I wrote the sentence that I think, looking back, was the real center of everything I witnessed that year. The question isn't whether they'll come to her. The question is whether she'll still be standing there when they do. The first snow came on the 7th of November, which was 2 weeks earlier than the prior 5-year average, and 3 weeks earlier than anyone in the county had planned for. It came overnight, the way the first serious snow of a difficult winter often does, politely, in the dark, so that when you step outside in the morning the world has been rearranged while you were sleeping and nobody thought to warn you. 4 inches on the ground by dawn, and the sky above it still moving, still delivering, in the patient way of weather that has decided it has a point to make. I was staying at the county's boarding accommodation that week, a building that used the word hotel more aspirationally than accurately, and I stepped outside with my coffee and my logbook and stood in the early morning dark looking at what the snow had done to the visible sections of the county road. Then I saddled up and rode out to Della's property, because by that point I had stopped pretending there was always a professional reason. She was already outside. This did not surprise me. She was walking the edge of her wheat sections with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment, pausing at intervals, crouching occasionally to look at something close to the ground. She had on a heavy coat that had the look of something her grandfather might have worn, and her breath was making small clouds in the frozen air. And she was not looking at the snow the way most people in the county were looking at it, with alarm or defeat or the specific variety of despair that comes from watching your plans get buried, but with something more analytical, calculating. "The wheat's all right," I said when I reached her. It was a statement, not a question. "The wheat's all right," she confirmed. "A good snow cover is actually beneficial, insulates the root zone. It's a hard freeze without snow that damages winter wheat. And the soil." She stood up from her crouching position. "The soil doesn't care about snow," she said. "The soil's doing what it's been doing all fall, holding moisture, feeding the root system, being what I built it to be." She looked at me, and there was something different in her expression this morning that I tried to pin down. Not pride, not satisfaction, something quieter. "4 years," she said. "You know what 4 years of amended, rotated, intentionally managed soil looks like in November of a dry year with early snow. Tell me." "It looks like this," she said simply, and gestured at the field. I looked at the field. It was modest. It was covered in snow like every other field for 40 miles. But underneath the snow, I knew from everything I'd watched all year that there was something different in the ground. Something put there deliberately, grain of soil by grain of soil, over seasons and seasons of patient, unfashionable work. Howard Hartley came on a Wednesday. I know this because I was there, not by design exactly, but not entirely by accident. I had a legitimate reason to be at the Voss property that morning. Final survey confirmation on a boundary marker in the northwest corner of her land that tied into the Braden parcel. But I had timed the visit with the awareness that Hartley had left the feed store on Tuesday saying, to nobody, and to everybody simultaneously in the way that he'd learned to communicate things he wasn't sure about, that he was thinking of riding out toward the South County on Wednesday. The South County was where Della's land was. He arrived at 9 in the morning on a gray horse I'd seen him ride for years, and he tied it at the post near the well and stood looking at the house for a moment before he knocked. I was at the northwest corner of the property, doing legitimate survey work, but the sight lines were clear, and I kept my head mostly down. Della answered the door. She was in her work dress, apron on, which meant she'd been preparing to go back outside. She looked at Hartley for a moment, just looked. He took off his hat. He did it in one motion that was slightly awkward, the motion of a man performing a gesture he'd decided on beforehand and was now executing with imperfect ease. "Morning, Della," he said. "Howard," she said. A pause, a real one, the kind that has weight in it. "My north section's in bad shape," he said. "I know. My east section's not much better. The emergence rate is," he stopped, started again. "It's not what I expected." "I know that too." Another pause. Hartley looked at the ground briefly and then back at her. "I've been doing some reading," he said, "about soil management, nitrogen cycles. There's some literature out of the agricultural colleges back east that makes some of the arguments you've been." He stopped again. "I want to understand your system," he said. It came out without the frame around it he'd probably planned to put there. Just the sentence plain. Della looked at him for 5 seconds. I counted them. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." I finished my survey work and tied off the corner marker and stayed near the fence for longer than was strictly professional. Through the window of Della's house, I could see them sitting at the kitchen table. She had apparently retrieved the grandmother's journals, the actual physical journals, the ones she'd mentioned to me in April, and she'd put them on the table between them, open to some page I couldn't see. She was talking. He was looking at the open page. At some point, she got up and went to a cabinet and returned with what looked like her own notebooks. The small ones she kept in her apron, multiplied across a shelf, a year's worth of record-keeping, the rotation logs and amendment records and soil observation notes of 7 years of intentional farming. She put them on the table. Hartley reached out and touched the cover of the top one, not opening it, just touching it. The gesture of someone encountering something that has been underestimated for a long time and is only now being recognized as what it actually is. I wrote in my logbook, she didn't just hand him the answer. She handed him the record of every year of work that led to the answer. That was important. He needed to understand that the yield comes after the work, not instead of it. The conversation between Hartley and Della lasted 3 hours. I know this because I ate lunch at a distance, noting the horses and the absence of movement at the property boundary. And when he finally came out at just past noon, he had his hat in his hands and a look on his face that I categorized in my logbook as a man who has learned something that he wishes were simpler than it is. He untied his horse. He stood there for a moment. Then he knocked on the door again. Della opened it. "Would you be willing to come out and look at my north section?" he said. "I want to understand what you'd see when you look at it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "When do you need me?" "Tomorrow would be soon enough," he said, "if that works for you." "Tomorrow works," she said. He rode away. Della stood in her doorway for a moment after his horse moved down the county road, and I had the sense, watching from the northwest corner, that she was feeling several things simultaneously and doing the thing she always did with complicated feelings, holding them very still until they settled into something she could use. Then she went back inside. Tom Combs came 2 days later on a Friday with his eldest son beside him. They arrived at 7 in the morning before I was there, and Della had apparently already been in her fields when they arrived. The son, a young man named Marcus who I'd observed at the county exchange and assessed as someone who listened more than he spoke, had his father's soil sample in a cloth bag. He'd actually taken a soil sample. He dug it up from his family's struggling field, put it in a bag, and brought it to show her. I heard about this from Jansen SR, later that week who'd heard it from Combs himself. She looked at it, Combs had told him. Just looked at it in her hands, and she said, "Your organic matter content is very low. You've got the soil structure of a field that's been pushed too hard without being fed. This is fixable, but not in one season." And then she told him what it would take. What did Combs say? He said, "How long?" And she said, 2 years before you see significant improvement, 3 before it's what it should be." And he stood there, and then he said, "Can we start this spring?" Jansen SR paused. She said yes, he said. The Braden brothers did not come themselves. They sent their youngest, a man in his mid-20s named Cal, who had the particular nervousness of someone dispatched to do something his older brothers couldn't quite bring themselves to do directly. Cal Braden showed up with a list of questions written on a folded piece of paper. He stood at Della's door with the paper in one hand and his hat in the other, and he said, reading from the list, "My brothers want to know if you'd be willing to consult on soil restoration. Paid if you're willing." Della looked at the folded paper. "Paid how much?" she said. Cal looked startled, like he hadn't expected negotiation. "They didn't," he cleared his throat. "They said to offer you reasonable compensation for your time." "My time is worth the same as anyone's," she said. "I'll come out, look at the fields, give them my assessment. After that, if they want ongoing consultation, we can discuss a proper arrangement." Cal Braden looked enormously relieved at having a clear answer to bring back. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you." He started to turn. "Cal," she said. He turned back. "Tell your brothers they don't need to send you." Her voice was not unkind. "They can come themselves." He held her look for a moment, then nodded. The weeks that followed were the strangest I had witnessed in 11 years of working these territories. Because what happened wasn't a dramatic reversal. It wasn't the community gathering to formally apologize to Della Voss, or the church social hosting a tribute to her methods, or Howard Hartley standing up at a public meeting and saying explicitly that he had been wrong. None of that happened. What happened was quieter and more real, and in some ways harder to watch. One by one, and then in small clusters, the farmers of Lander County began asking Della questions. Not always directly, not always comfortably. Hartley visited her fields twice in November, and on the second visit he brought a soil sample from his own land and asked her what she saw in it, the same way Combs's son had done. She told him. He listened with the full attention of a man who had finally decided to use his intelligence in the direction of understanding rather than defending. And the intelligence, and it was there, I want to be fair to him, was genuinely useful once it stopped being used against the wrong thing. The Combs family started an amendment program. It was going to take 2 years, as Della had said, and it was going to cost them in effort, in yield foregone, in the patience of doing things that didn't produce immediate visible results. But they started. The Braden brothers came themselves, both of them. They stood at Della's fence line in December with the snow coming down again, and she walked them through what she saw in their fields, and I watched from the road as the older Braden, a man who had, I knew, been one of the more enthusiastic participants in the county's opinion of Della's methods, listened to a woman he'd publicly dismissed for 2 years explain what was wrong with his land and how to begin fixing it. He didn't thank her, not that day. But he listened, and he came back. In early December, I stopped at Della's property to return a soil compaction reference document she'd loaned me during one of our conversations. She had a shelf of agricultural literature that would have impressed a university library, and I found her at the kitchen table with 3 notebooks open and a 4th in her hand. She was updating her records. She did it every evening, she'd mentioned once. The amendment logs, the rotation notes, the observations about soil response and plant development. The same patient record-keeping she'd been doing for 7 years. I sat across from her and had coffee while she finished, and when she closed the last notebook and looked up at me, I said, "They're coming around." "Yes," she said. "How does it feel?" She was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving the dead grass along the fence line in long, rhythmic waves. "You want me to say it feels good," she said. "I want you to say whatever's true." She looked at the notebooks on the table. 7 years of them, stacked in the cabinet, paper and ink, and the careful labor of someone who had kept doing the right thing through years of being told it was the wrong thing. "It feels right," she said finally. "Not satisfying, right, like when you do a long calculation and then the answer confirms the method. It doesn't feel like winning, it feels like the math working out." "That's a generous way to put it." She looked at me. "The people who mocked me weren't bad people," she said carefully. "They were scared people who bet on what they knew against what I knew, and the evidence wasn't in yet." She paused. "The evidence is in now. It's not going to feel good to be the one who was right when the people who were wrong are losing fields and running short on winter stores." I thought about that. "Does it change anything," I said, "that some of them are willing to learn now?" She looked at the table for a long moment. Then, "It changes the next spring," she said. "That's not nothing, that's actually everything." She stood and put the notebooks away in the cabinet, one by one, with the careful hands of someone handling something that has cost them a great deal, and is worth every cent of that cost. I left Lander County in January, when my survey contract finally concluded, and the Braden boundary dispute was resolved to everyone's begrudging satisfaction. On my last morning, I rode the county road from one end to the other, the way I'd done most mornings that year. The snow was hard and the light was low, and the fields were all buried in white, undifferentiated, the good soil and the exhausted soil looking exactly alike under 4 inches of snow. But I knew what was underneath. I stopped in front of Della's property for the last time. She was at the fence line, wrapped in the grandfather's coat, checking one of the fence posts that had shifted in the freeze. She looked up when she heard my horse. We looked at each other across the fence. "Your spring is going to be different from theirs," I said. "Yes," she said. "Are you going to help them through it?" She went back to the fence post, checked the tension on the wire, made a small adjustment. "Already am," she said. I opened my logbook for the last entry I would write from Lander County, and I wrote, "The mockery never touched the soil. It never touched the work. It only ever touched her, and she made the decision years ago to let it touch and then pass through and not stay. I've watched a lot of people make a lot of decisions in this territory. That one, the decision to keep working while being laughed at, is one of the bravest I've seen, and it's one of the least dramatic to observe. Which might be exactly why it's so easy to miss until the drought comes, and the soil shows you what it was built from." I closed the book. I looked at her fields one more time. The even rows of winter wheat showing their patient green at the snow's edge, where she'd cleared the drift from the closest section. The six-part rotation that would roll forward into spring, into summer, into the next season, and the next, building and feeding and returning what it took.